Hello and welcome to Writers and Books Visiting Author Series. My name is Dan Hurd. I'm the Director of Adult Programs. Writers and Books is a nonprofit literary arts center in Rochester, New York. We offer readings, workshops, and literary programming for people of all ages, all currently available online. Our theme for 2021 is Taking Care. We're celebrating different ways we can take care of ourselves and take care of others this year. You can check out our upcoming schedule at wab.org. Please say hello in the chat and let us know you're there. Feel free to submit questions to the Q&A function. Books are available through our bookstore, Ampersand Books. I'll put the link in the chat. We're so happy to have Deanne Quinn Miller and Gary Craig with us this evening. First, we'll hear a selection, and then they'll have some time to talk. Deanne Quinn Miller was 5 years old when her father, William Quinn, was murdered in the first minutes of the Attica Prison Riot, the only corrections officer to die at the hands of inmates. When she joined the Forgotten Victims of Attica, she began the process of bringing closure not only for herself, but for the other victims' families, the former prisoners she met, and all of those who perished on September 13th, 1971, the day of the retaking, when the New York State troopers and corrections officers slaughtered 29 rioting prisoners and 10 hostages. In The Prison Guard's Daughter, Dee brings readers in on her lifelong mission for truth and justice for the Attica survivors and the families of the men who lost their lives. Her journey crossed racial and criminal justice divides. As Miller lays bare the truth about her father's death, the world inside Attica, and the state's reckless raid and cover-up, she conveys a narrative of compassionate humanity and a call for prison reform. Deanne Quinn Miller is the co-founder of the Forgotten Victims of Attica. Since 2014, she has been the program coordinator for the Veterans Defense Program of the New York State Defenders Association, a program that provides support and legal aid to struggling veterans in the criminal justice system. Miller lives in Batavia, New York. Gary Craig is an investigative reporter with the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle. He's the author of 7 Million, about the unsolved Rochester Brinks heist. Since 2000, he has written extensively about Attica, including the resolution of the decades-long lawsuit filed by Attica inmates against the state. He lives in Rochester, New York. Deanne and Gary, thank you so much for being here.
Sure. Thank you, Dan. So Dee, I'll just start off here with a bit of an introduction, then turn over to you for the reading, if that sounds okay.
Sounds great.
Yeah. So thanks everybody for coming. Dan gave you the history there of the uprising. To a degree, there's we could talk for hours about that, but as he said, Dee's father on September 9th suffered injuries, sadly, that led to his death 2 days later. The inmates grabbed up 36 plus hostages when they took control of the prison. And then on September 13th, state police stormed the prison in a retaking that, as Dan said, 39 ultimately were dead. So that tells you sadly how well it was planned there. And I've gotten to know Dee for, well, since 2000, over 20 plus years now. And her story of what she learned, not just about her father, but about the Attica event in and of itself, was just always very inspiring to me, because she crossed lines that sadly most people these days aren't willing to cross, whether it's lines dealing with inmates, when obviously she came from a family of correction officer, whether it's racial lines, to be honest. And it was always a message to me that we can all be better. And I think her life story is just a prime example of that. We can talk more about it after the readings if you have questions and all, but I'll turn it over to you now, Dee.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you, Dan, for that introduction. I have chosen 2 readings tonight to begin with that that I personally like a lot. The first reading is from the prologue portion of the book, and I think that it sums up nicely my personal journey to find out who my father was, and to investigate his murder, because it was something as a child I really knew nothing about. This book is a memoir, so it's very personal. It's about my journey and about my evolution And unlike other books that have been written about Attica, I'm not a historian. I'm just a person who lived through Attica and believes that Attica is a part of who I am and forever will be a part of who I am. And on this journey, like Gary was talking about, took me to a lot of places. And one of those places in this excerpt that I'm going to read is I had an opportunity to go down to New York City to meet some of the inmates that ended up giving me some information about my dad. So I'll read that part right now. Bear with me. The Attica community. So this is a prologue, page 14, if anybody's got their book, but the Attica community where I lived as a child before we moved in an unsuccessful attempt to escape the memories of what we've endured and suffered there, would become synonymous with American racism and bigotry. As an adult, I knew that this was a simplistic and unfair portrayal. Many corrections officers, my dad among them, had treated inmates with respect before the riot ignited. But that was more of a complicated narrative than the black and white story told by many in the media and popular culture. I had personally learned the simple narrative was often wrong, an empty vessel for the storyteller to shape with his or her preconceptions. I knew because I had relied on that narrative that the Attica riot, the initial chaotic uprising that killed my father, and the violent retaking by police days later, in which 39 people were fatally shot, was the fault of inmates and inmates alone. By late 2000, I had learned better, and here I was to meet Richard Clark, the man once considered a ringleader of the riot, and a man once charged with several dozen criminal counts of kidnapping for the hostage taking during the rebellion. As I discovered in the months before my visit to Harlem, Clark was only a ringleader in the sense that he gathered up other Muslim prisoners for a security detail that ensured the prison employees taken hostage by inmates were kept safe. He was a peacekeeper, not an instigator. I'd also learned that he tried to save my father's life. Throughout my childhood and after, I was told little about my father. I had tried for years to piece together who he was, and I often ran into roadblocks, even within my own family. What I did know was that Corrections Officer William Quinn was inextricably and forever linked with the Attica Prison Riot. He was the riot's first casualty and the only man who died at the hands of prisoners. I could not fully learn of my father if I did not truly learn of the riot. By the time I sat down in a Harlem restaurant, waiting for the arrival of Clark, I had pushed aside my long-held beliefs about who was to blame for the prisoner revolt at Attica. And I had learned a great deal about my father, though there was still so much to understand. I had decided that men like Clark could help me. And now he has agreed to meet me and tell me just what he had done on September 9th of 1971, in what was an unsuccessful attempt to save my bloodied and beaten father. For many, Attica is a lesson in a history book, or it's a television documentary about politics and prison reform, or a fictionalized and sensationalized film. For me, it is far more personal than that. It is the story of my father, of my family, and of me. I cannot separate my identity from the Attica riot, although often in life I had wanted to do just that. But long before this morning, as I waited for Richard Clark to stroll into the restaurant, I made up my mind. I will learn all I can and speak to whoever I can, and my father will someday be whole for me. Richard Clark is one piece of the puzzle, an important piece, and I was there to listen. So that is one of, I think, the excerpts that I personally like a lot. I think it tells a lot about the kind of frame of mind that I had to be in as I was older, and going to into the search of trying to find out exactly what happened to my dad and who he was as a person. The second excerpt that I chose actually takes us much further into the book, onto page 164, and it talks about a time when I'm older and I'm involved in the group called the Forgotten Victims of Attica. And we were a group of individuals that are 50 families strong. And we were the families of those whose fathers were killed or injured when they were held hostage, and those that survived being held hostage. And what we asked for was an opportunity for our stories to be told, because many of the hostages had never told their stories before. So we asked for a task force from New York State, Governor Pataki, and we had the opportunity to tell our stories, not only to the Attica Task Force members, but also to the public, so that they could hear our stories for the first time and understand just what Attica had taken from us, emotionally and physically. So this is an excerpt as I'm talking about my mom, and I'm retelling her parts of her testimony. So this is from 2002, when we are members of the Forgotten Victims of Attica. So here we go. My sister Amy was born 8 months after my father's death. A nurse came into the waiting room to tell the proud father of Amy's arrival, but there was no father present. Both of my grandfathers were there and explained to the nurse our family circumstances. When I held, this is my mother quoting, when I held Amy for the first time with her huge blue eyes, long eyelashes, and dark hair, I knew that Bill was with me all through the pregnancy and the delivery, my mother said. My mother reminded the task force that the men convicted of killing and beating my father had gone free, and that was another insult. When is this going to end, she asked the task force. The families existed in poverty and emotional upheaval. Apparently, it looks to me as if more time and effort and consideration was used to cover up the riot than to help the state's own employees and families. Years later, when I would read transcripts of my mother's testimony for the first time and seemed like an eternity, I had to take a break. I began reading them one night before bed, and the ache in my mother's words were just too much for me. I laid the transcript aside, knowing I would not sleep if I read anymore. They were no easier for me to read the next day. I knew what strength my mother had to gather to do this. There were members of the Forgotten Victims of Attica who had chosen to give written testimony to the task force. Some did so because they doubted the task force would do anything for us. Some simply did not want to testify publicly. Some lived too far away or were physically unable. My mother could have chosen that route as well, but she sat before a panel for half an hour, reliving the most painful days, months, and years of her life. She endured that historical record. She ensured that the historical record would not forget Bill Quinn, the darling of her life, the man who'd been stolen from her. My husband was murdered and forgotten by our prison and judicial system, she said. Bill went to work on September 9th, and my life has never been the same. I think that I learned a lot about my mother as well as I went through this journey, what my mother endured, and very difficult to read her testimony and everyone else that testified in 2002. Gary, are you on?
I'm back.
Great.
Yeah, Dee and I can just sort of talk back and forth here, but if you have questions, please ask them. I'll just sort of tell quickly how this came to be, if that sounds okay, Dee. As Dee talked about the Forgotten Victims of Attica, I covered the inmate settlement. The inmates sued the state in a lawsuit that wound through the courts for 20 plus years and was finally resolved in 2000 and went to Judge Teleska, who decided how much money the inmates should get with a settlement, 1,000 plus. He had to divide it up. And that gave rise to the Forgotten Victims of Attica, Dee's group. And I got to know those folks, Dee obviously included. And Forgotten Victims really fought hard to make sure those employees weren't forgotten. I mean, they're the people who really suffered, and the state did everything it could to sadly kind of cover up. But so what happened this past year, with the 50th anniversary approaching, I guess I approached you, Dee, right? and talked about more about doing her story, because again, as I said, it's just so inspiring to me. And then with the 50th anniversary approaching, we got a publisher, and we wrote it in probably all of 6 weeks, maybe. And it was fast. It was around. And oddly, COVID sort of helped us in an odd way, because we were both working from home, and we could both, we would set out a chapter, and I would talk to Dee, and she would tell me as much as she could, and then I would write or she would write, and we would go back and forth. And oddly enough, COVID, I think, helped, because we would have been bouncing back and forth from our work offices otherwise. But we, again, as we said, we can talk about a lot. We can talk about the Forgotten Victims of Attica. Dee, do you want to talk about sort of what the state did with the workers' comp? Because I don't think people really know how you guys were shafted by the state in the aftermath. A lot of people don't know.
Sure. I always love to talk about how we were shafted by the state.
That's my prelude. Yes.
Yeah. So I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand and believe for many years, I think, because there was a lot of rumors that, the inmates had a lawsuit, that went on in the court for decades, and that, the families never sued because they supposedly were taken care of. And that really couldn't be farther from the truth. What ended up happening with the state in terms of their ability to care for those state employees that were killed or injured and could not return to work, and hostages, were that they encouraged those that were injured or hurt to take 6 months off, and they guaranteed them that they would pay them their regular paycheck, and just to take some time off and to come back in 6 months. And the widows, so there were 11 widows, 10 that were killed in the yard that day, and of course my father, who was injured on the 9th and died on the 11th. They said, don't worry, widows, we're going to take good care of you. We're going to continue to give you your husband's paycheck at whatever salary they were currently at. And what ended up happening is that when they sent these checks out to take care of us, what was in there was a form of workman's compensation, which was not noted on the front of the check. So there was no way for anyone to know that there was workman's compensation. There was no note. There was nothing to indicate that there was workman's compensation in those checks. And as soon as the widows cashed those checks, they unknowingly, which is a clause within New York state law, gave up their election of remedy. So what ended up happening is that it essentially, those checks that they needed to cash to take care of their families, as soon as they cashed them, because the workman's compensation was in them, they unknowingly lost their right to sue. And so the inmates obviously didn't have that right, because they weren't employees of the state of New York. So they decided to sue. Like I said, their lawsuit was in the courts for decades and decades, until 2000, when Judge Teleska came in as kind of the closer for that deal. We could not sue. None of the families could not sue because of that election of remedy. So I think that's one thing I always like to make sure that people are clear about, because I think that lots of people think that, we were taken care of in some manner or another, whether we were given an award of money per family. I've heard that one before, but indeed, that's not the way it went.
And just there were 11 widows. There was obviously Dee's mom, 9 other widows from the men who died in the yard during the retaking, and 10 other widows. I'm sorry. I guess so there's a total of 11 widows, and the widow who did not cash a check was this woman, Linda Jones, who lost her husband. And she actually, she received a small check for payment for coverage of a meal, if I recall correctly, Dee. And a lawyer said, don't cash this. And sure enough, she was the only one able to sue the state because of that. And she ultimately ended up, after like 10 years of wrangling, by the time the interest was added on to the amount that she finally got, with over $1 million. I noticed, I checked the Q&A, and I'll start this, Dee, and there's a question about, do we know Heather Ann Thompson's book and what we think of it? Dee is actually very prominent in Heather's book, and I think was a very vital source for Heather's book when you get to the part of the Forgotten Victims of Attica and about Dee's father and everything. And it, is, I think, it's clearly one of the top histories of the uprising there. She did, I think Heather did 10 years of work. And she records that nobody else has ever seen that she wasn't supposed to get, but thankfully the clerk at the office did not realize that when they gave her access to the grand jury records. But I would also highly recommend pairing with that the books by Malcolm Bell, the prosecutor who was charged with prosecuting police, the turkey shoot, and a subsequent book he wrote, because I think those two together, if you're looking for something that's purely historical, probably give you a really well-rounded picture of that. So your thoughts on
Yeah.
that? Yeah.
I think you're right. I mean, obviously Heather is a historian. Malcolm Bell's book, Malcolm was the assistant attorney general at the time, and he was in charge of prosecution of state troopers and corrections officers who were involved in the retaking. So they are similar in terms of their historic nature. Obviously Malcolm being there and being part of it, Heather coming in as a historical person and kind of showing Attica in all its ugliness, if you will, from most every angle that she could find. I did assist Heather quite a bit with her book. In the end, it's her book, and she's a Pulitzer Prize winner. So there's clearly plenty of people who enjoyed her book. Malcolm's book, I think, is awesome. And if I'm not mistaken, Malcolm Bell's book, The Turkey Shoot, is going to be re-released for anybody who's interested. I know otherwise it's pretty hard to get it. You got to find it on eBay, but I believe it's going to be re-released.
And also I'll note Dee's father was a very handsome man, and to give proof of that, he's right over her right shoulder right now.
Yeah.
The photograph. Yes, right there. Dee, when you were reading, those readings, by the way, were wonderful. That's this is actually the first time I think that we've done readings, right? We've just done talks and answered Q&A stuff. But actually, I'm gonna play a reporter and throw a question at you, I guess. And you touched on it when reading those parts from the transcripts of the Forgotten Victims are just so powerful to me. We both went through and read the transcripts again when we were doing this, and it just still rips my heart apart. But when you started, it seemed as if, and I could be completely wrong, but at the start of this, you knew your mom had been strong during this, but perhaps it became much more apparent during the work on this. Would that be accurate to say? Is that fair to say?
Yeah. I mean, I think I didn't understand a lot of why my mom did a lot of the things that she did. It was difficult when I was growing up because we didn't talk about my dad really. And I think that was kind of, we're talking about 1970, 1971, 50 years ago, when people dealt with things very differently. And, when you take a look at that and you compare it to how we would deal with something like this now, clearly we wouldn't stop talking about it. Clearly we would be much more careful about, cashing checks to make sure that, there wasn't anything that, precluded us from suing in it. We're much more, of a different generation. But yeah, watching my mom go through what she did, there was often times in my life when I was, frustrated and sad because, I couldn't get the information out of her. And as I got older, I understood, certainly through her testimony, but also just talking to my mother, just how very difficult it was for my mother to talk about what happened to my dad. And she just loved him so much, and the plans that they had for the rest of their life together, certainly over a 2-day period were just completely gone. And in reading my mother's testimony, and even though my sisters and I helped her prepare the testimony, it was probably one of the most difficult things I have ever had to do and read and proof. And then my mother would add more to it. And sometimes she'd add it and I'd say, I never knew that, Mom. And so I think the testimony, however difficult it was really good for all of us, because we had the opportunity to learn some more things about my father that my mother hadn't mentioned before, even though it was, ripped my heart out. Holy smokes.
Well, see a question from somebody I know. So I can start this if you want, Dee.
Go ahead.
What do you think of Judge Teleska's decision? So you have to remember, so Judge Teleska was basically charged with deciding how much money the inmates would get based on their suffering, et cetera. And as Dee said, he was the closer, and that was actually a nickname of his. I've always found what he did incredibly just powerful. I mean, Judge Teleska could have easily basically told the 1,000+ inmates, write down for me what happened to you in the yard, because you had to be in the yard to be part of the compensation, and I'll decide from there. But Judge Teleska said, no, he said, I'm going to give these people that want the chance to tell their story to come to federal court in Rochester and do it. And there were days that busloads would come from New York City of former Attica inmates, and every one of them was given the opportunity to walk in front of Judge Teleska. Many of them said they'd never had the chance before. And I just thought, his recognition of them as people, as something other than inmates, was very powerful. And I talked to Judge Teleska a lot during that time. That's really how I got involved. And I asked him sometimes, because there's a lot of people that would not think that inmates deserve that treatment. And and he basically said, I always remember the line. He said, the Constitution doesn't stop at the jailhouse door. And he's right. The Eighth Amendment's supposed to get rid of cruel and unusual punishment, and that's sadly what was happening at Attica with the conditions for the inmates before the riot erupted. And so personally, I've always found him, sadly we lost him last year. What he did, I thought was just something that we could all learn from. And then of course he took on the task of resolving the Forgotten Victims of Attica. And Dee got to know Judge Teleska very well during that time, correct?
Right. Yeah. I love Judge Teleska. I thought he was a wonderful man. Although originally I was not very thrilled. As you can imagine, I was, back then I had very strong feelings about Judge Teleska and the fact that the inmates were, going to be able to get money in the first place. And I had to walk myself through kind of the legal aspects of why this was going on. And once I understood that, that essentially, the inmates that were in the yard during the rehousing were the inmates that had the opportunity to file a claim, for their treatment and abuse, then I kind of, I was able to understand a little bit better. But the one thing that always upset me was that I ended up finding out that the two men that were later charged with my father's murder and then was charged with assault, John Hill and Charles Pernasseles, that they were also in Judge Teleska's decision. And I found out that they could be claimants, that they could claim. And I thought, in 1976, and this is something, this is like obviously going back, but, the man who killed my dad, John Hill, he was found guilty of the murder of a peace officer and was sent to prison for life. But in 1976, December 31st, 1976, then Governor Hugh Carey pardoned Pernasseles. His conviction stayed, but his sentence was pardoned. So when I found out that he was in the yard and that he may very well get money out of this, I wasn't having it. And so I wrote a very stern letter to Judge Teleska, and I thought, what the heck, right? I don't know if I can fight City Hall about this or not. And ended up getting a phone call from Judge Teleska, which I was so surprised about. And by the way, getting a phone call from Judge Teleska, I think is a lot like getting a phone call from the president, because you had to go through Joan Countryman. But anyhow, and he explained to me the thing, and he said, Dee, I understand, why you feel this way. And he said, let me see, what I can work out. And I was completely surprised, but he ended up kind of removing their names. Although they got paid, he ended up removing their names ultimately from the El Jundi decision. And, they essentially, their money was given to the attorneys and paid out that way. But on the face of it, it doesn't look like as if they were paid. And he did that, I think, because he understood, the years of what it was like for our family to have to live with these people who had assaulted and murdered my father. And now here they are, able to get money because of their injuries in the yard, that day. So, I have great respect. And of course, like you said, I was able to work with him for several years as he settled the Forgotten Victims of Attica settlement. And like you said, very fair man. He did a great job on the inmates, but when it came to us, I think honestly, and I know you and I have talked about this before, but the toll that had taken on him, I think emotionally and physically for him was so great. we were able to give testimony and write to him, and he, would read our testimony. But I think it was by then too difficult for him emotionally to listen to our testimony. So the Forgotten Victims of Attica, we each took our opportunity to write in our testimony, and then, he did the settlement like that. He's a great man.
Yep. Yes, definitely. One thing, sort of feeding off what Dee was talking about there, with the pardons and the sentence commutations of the folks involved in the death of her father. One thing that's worth sort of remembering when you talk about the history of Attica is the death of Dee's father really perhaps changed the trajectory of what happened there. I mean, just talking about the uprising itself, because he suffered the injuries on the 9th, he died on the 11th, and by many accounts, the negotiations between the inmates and the authorities, which were helped by a group called observers, which are civil rights lawyers like William Kunstler and Tom Wicker, the New York Times columnist, were making progress. But then when Dee's father died on the 11th, the inmates realized that they could all be charged with his murder, because if you participated in the riot that led to the death, you could be charged with a felony murder. And that then amnesty for those crimes became part of the request, and that changed the entire dynamic, because the law enforcement authorities were not ready to grant amnesty for the crimes that had been committed during the riot. The sad irony of it is, hindsight being everything, obviously amnesty was not granted on the September 13th. They stormed the prison, and the many deaths happened that we've talked about, still the deadliest prison riot in US history. But essentially what happens, as Dee was talking about in 1976, basically amnesty happens. I mean, to close the books on Attica to ensure that police and others were not prosecuted, and the inmates who were being prosecuted, that all stopped. Basically, the amnesty that was sought on September 11th, 1971 was granted 5 years later, pretty much. But hindsight being everything, who knew that would happen? But it's just, the sad irony is, perhaps things could have been different, or even if they had held out. We've talked about this a lot, Dee. If they'd held out on September 13th, Dee and I have both talked to inmates that have said we were ready to just call it quits, but sadly they stormed the prison that morning.
That's true. Yeah, you're right.
Any other questions? Because Dee and I can keep asking Dee questions, of course. And one thing, just return. I mean, actually, I'm going to ask you a question, Dee, based on the reading. But one thing I do want to note, based on your reading, in case people missed this, is Dee talked about her youngest sister, who was, your mom found out she was actually pregnant with your youngest sister after the death of your dad, correct?
Yeah, it was a terrible time. I mean, my mother, was not feeling well about 6 weeks after my father was buried on the 15th of September, 1971. And, it was some weeks after that we had, my mother and I both went to the doctor. We weren't feeling well. I had some stomach issues, of course. I think it was just like a child who doesn't really understand that, what exactly is going on. But my mother went, and although I ended up having stomach problems, my mother ended up having morning sickness, and and found out that she was 6 weeks pregnant, which was, I think, for my mother, as she describes it, such a wonderful thing, and she was so happy. But I think there was many other people in our family and outside of our family that worried for my mother, being pregnant at this time, at such a stressful time. There was obviously, for her, there was no way that she wasn't going to continue the pregnancy. Yeah.
And just another thing I want to pick up on your reading, because you talked about Richard Clark and meeting Richard in Harlem. Could you talk about what you found out? You talked about Richard trying to help your dad. Can you talk about what he actually did when he came upon your father injured?
Sure. So Richard knew my dad, as a correctional officer, and when Richard came through Times Square, this was after the initial, riot began, and my father had been, severely injured by the inmates that had gone through Times Square, which is where my father was, which is the central hub of the prison. And when he came through, he knew it was my dad, apparently, even though he was in terrible shape. And Richard found a mattress in the A block and had 3 of his Muslim friends pick my dad up and put him on the mattress and carried him to the administration building, which was a separate building, outside, and said essentially, this is one of yours, this is an officer who's been hurt and he needs help. And that's where Richard left my dad. And then they were told to go back. But I never knew that story at all. And I guess, growing up, I never thought like, who got my dad out of Times Square? I just always made the assumption naively, that other officers went in and rescued my dad, from Times Square as he was leaving, there. But that's not what happened at all. As a matter of fact, I ended up finding out that my dad was on that mattress. I did speak with a correction officer who did help carry then the mattress from the ground floor of administration up to where people clock in. And unfortunately, I've heard people say that they stepped over my dad as he lay on the mattress to clock in to help retake the prison. And that it was well over 2 hours, going on 3, before my father was transferred out to Batavia Hospital, where he was then transferred to a Rochester hospital for his head injuries.
And we have another question that I'm going to throw at you here, Dee, with a little prelude. It's about Frank Smith. And I'll just give a quick, Frank Smith was, one of the inmates, and Frank, who went by Big Black, and accused of things he did not do during the riot. And after the retaking, he was just brutally tortured. He was laid on his back with a football put under his throat and lit cigarettes dropped upon him, and he was beaten. And he was really sort of the lead plaintiff and the lead organizer of the inmates. And I got to know Frank, and Dee did too. And Dee and I've joked about this, and I'm leading into a question. I know you probably know where I'm going, Dee, where I calling Frank Black just seemed odd to me, because it just seemed, basically, calling him by his race, it's like, but Frank always just, he would call and he would say, hey, it's Black, hey, it's Big Black. And finally at the point is like, okay, you're Big Black, I'm going to call you Black. I know that's what you want to be. It just seemed I had a hard time doing that. But Dee, I want you to talk about your friendship with Black, but also how you overcame that, what you guys decided, because I know you had the same issue calling him that.
Yeah, I definitely had the same issue. I felt like, just so uneasy just saying, hey, Black, but that's what he preferred. And I would call him Big Black. So we kind of made a deal. And he basically said, you can call me Big Black and I'll call you Little White. And I said, deal. And that's kind of talked to each other, which is silly, but it both made us feel, better. But Frank and I forged, through your help, Gary, really, we forged a really great relationship that was, for me, and I hope for him, so healing, because we asked each other, we talked to each other nearly weekly up until 2003. Which is unfortunate, because it was only about a year or so that I had that opportunity to kind of really get to know Frank, because I think that was 2000, maybe it was 2001 when I was able to start talking with him. So maybe 2 years. But we would talk about things all the time on a Sunday night. And, I got to ask him a lot of questions about what was going on inside, the prison, because he was one of the head Muslim security officers who, basically told all the other inmates to make sure that they protected our state employees and corrections officers and civilian employees that were held hostage in that circle, to protect them with their life. So Frank really was able to shine a lot of light on what was going on during those 5 days for me that I never knew. And, just come to know him as such a really kind and gentle man, who obviously, he went a little wrong, like when he was younger. He went into a craps game and, with a gun, and, because he had a drug addiction, and he robbed a craps game of his uncle's and ended up in Attica. So, but Black was, in my opinion, I just had a truly great relationship with him.
I'm thinking back to Richard. I mean, not only was there the meeting in Harlem that, we tell the story of. Oh, by the way, I'll put a quick plug in here before I forget. Dee and I will be at Barnes & Noble Pittsburgh from 2 to 4 on Sunday. So please come out if you can. And if you haven't bought the book, please do. But anyway, there, I've done my marketing. I'm getting better. But not Richard as well. You were still, I mean, beyond just meeting him in Harlem and him telling you, here's what I did for your dad. You actually kept touch with Richard really to the point where you mentioned drug addiction. You made me think of the conversation you had with him when he was in treatment and you were trying to find him.
Yeah. So Richard and I didn't have the relationship like Black and I did, but I did always want to keep in touch with Richard Clark. I was just humbled by his act, of taking care of my dad when he didn't have to. He could have kept right on, walking in the prison that day. And so I kept track of Richard even when he got out of prison. And he had always had some issues with drug addiction. And he was really trying very hard to get his life on track. Very intelligent man. And one of the last times I spoke to him, I'd always call him around Christmas. And I called his cell phone, and a woman answered the phone, and she answered it like it was like a treatment center, but I can't remember the name of it. And at that point, Mr. Clark was not supposed to have calls because he was in the middle of treatment. And so I go on this crazy rant about how I need to speak with him because this is a man who carried my father on the mattress. I think the woman thought I was probably insane. It was like, let me just get him. So she ended up going to get Richard, and I was able to speak with him and, wished him well. And it was later that year that Richard died, which was very sad.
Dan, do we have time for me to get Dee to tell one more story? There's a story, Dee, that you've told at a number of the talks we've done. And you have to remember, he was central to the Forgotten Victims of Attica. And, as far as the push for their demands, which they had 5 demands. One was, restitution was one, counseling, an annual ceremony at the prison ground, the opening of records, and an apology, which we still don't have. But Dee, can you tell the story about when you were getting calls directly from the governor's office about the settlement amount? Yeah, I'm sorry to bring up a bad topic. My apologies.
Okay. I'll make it quick because I think there's another question from Lori on there. So yeah, when we were in negotiations, we had hired this high-powered lobbyist, and we were making way with the second floor. And Artie Malcolm was our lobbyist, and the phone calls would come right to me in my home in the office from the second floor, which is Governor's Council. And so we had been in meetings all day long, and we had said, okay, this is what we're going to agree on. We want at least $12 million. That's what we'd like to have for this is like a decision of, they had decided that, yes, we would allow restitution. We were just negotiating them out. And so they would call and they would say, sometimes it was Senator Volker that would call, or sometimes it was Conley, who was Governor's Council at the time, said, okay, this is what we've come up with. We think $8 million is good. And the reason why they stuck on $8 million was because that's what the inmates got. And I said, but no. The inmates got $8 million, but your total was 12. He said, well, we gave $4,000 to, the attorneys, so we're going to have to pay your attorneys. They're like, no, our attorneys don't want any money. I actually had 2 pro bono attorneys that were the best people, either Jonathan Gradess and Gary Horton, who were both in public defense, wanted no money for 4 years of putting up with me, frankly, and the rest of the Forgotten Victims of Attica. And I said, so when they called and offered $8 million, I said, no, we're going to keep going. I think we can negotiate this out. Then they called a couple days later. This was in 2004, December of 2004. And then they offered $10 million. And I was like, we just had this meeting. I wasn't supposed to take anything less than 12. Artie Malcolm thought for sure we could get to 12. This is our lobbyist. So I, say no to $10 million. And that was Governor's Council called that time. And I could tell that he was not happy. And I was like, no, we're not taking 10. And I like stood this ground and then they didn't call back for some time. And then I ended up having like literally like a nervous breakdown. They didn't call back. We couldn't get a hold of anybody up at Governor's Council. Second floor was not returning our calls. And I ended up in the hospital that night, night of December 19th, I'll never forget. And I went in, and as you can imagine, I'm going into the ER of our tiny little hospital here in Batavia, and I'm mumbling things about, the government is offering me $10 million. And I said no, and I've ruined it for all these families. And I'm telling you, they all thought I was crazy. Who wouldn't? So I ended up getting a nice shot in the arm, and I woke up like the next day, But I will tell you, I really thought that I blew it. They did call back on December 23rd and offered 12 million final, and we took it.
We had a question about, I did a written answer about what do we think this could mean for prison reform, and my thought is, our purpose, at least my purpose in sort of trying, helping you tell your story, wasn't, what are we going to do for prison reform? It's ended up being part of that conversation. It wasn't really sort of, but at least to me personally, if it says anything, it says, one thing, just very quick snapshot, is the conditions at Attica that precipitated the riot, and folks like Dee's dad were aware and were warning the prison officials that this could happen if they didn't change things, were just awful sanitary conditions, a shower a week, a roll of toilet paper a month, you were being fed on 63 cents a day. There was censorship of, pretty innocuous magazines that were meant for people of color. They couldn't get the magazines. They're being thrown out. Muslim inmates weren't allowed to, really what they needed for prayer. So there was just truly human rights and constitutional violations. And actually, I haven't even talked to you about this, Dee. It was actually kind of reaffirming. I just spoke to a class of a retired police officer whom I know last week teach a criminal justice class, and he wanted me to talk about Attica some. And he had read the book, and he made the admission to the class that before reading the book, he did not give two, and I won't use the word he used, about what prisoner conditions were like. He didn't care. He locked them up. He didn't care what it was like. But he said, actually, after reading the book and understanding what precipitated the riot, that it changed his mind about that. So again, big picture, that wasn't, as Dee said, it's a memoir. But if anything, we just, I guess, hope that maybe people will see that at the end of the day, even if they're behind prison walls, they should be treated humanely.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think, on the flip side, not only did the inmates, get many of the demands that they asked for, if not all of the 26 demands, is that we also have additional safety measures in place for correction officers that were within our prison now. We don't have archaic communication systems. They have radios. We have CERT teams in almost all of the prisons as well. So I think, for both inmate and corrections officers who are marking time together, just some in 8 hours, 10 hours, and 12-hour shifts, and then they go home to their families, things did get better, I think, for both sides. If you're going to choose sides, which is what everybody wants to do, right? Things did get better for both inmates and corrections, safer.
And Dee mentions the system. When Dee's dad was trying to secure a gate where the inmates were pushing against it and ultimately gave way, he was using a telephone that the internal system at the prison, he could not make a call if anybody else was on the line. Only one person could use the line at a time. So he was unable to get word out as to what was going on, at least from his vantage point.
So true.
Dan, I know I don't know what, I'll open it.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid that'll be our time, but yeah, thank you to Gary Craig, Deanne Quinn Miller. I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank our funders. I have a slide here. There we go. Please buy the book at Ampersand Books. The link is in the chat. And I want to say thank you all for coming and have a great night.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for having us, Dan. Appreciate it.
Yes. Thank you. And thanks to Writers and Books. You guys do great work. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.